So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Jen Pye and I'm the director of the Monhegan Museum of Art and History. And tonight we have the honor to hear Captain Jonathan Bratton of the Maine National Guard. He'll be presenting at Home and Abroad, the Maine National Guard in World War II. And some background of this for us at the museum is that about a year ago, we were awarded a CARES Act grant by the National Endowment for the Humanities. And that was to create a multimedia online exhibition which explored the impact of World War II on Monhegan, both on those who went to war, which was almost all of the young men on the island, and remarkably, they all returned, but it was also about the impact of those who stayed here and how that affected the island, which we were really surprised to learn the extent of the impact on this we're such a remote location that to read and see pictures or paintings of, because there weren't really any photographs of who were stationed in the lighthouse and patrolled the backside of the island at night looking for submarines, and there were newly built destroyers passing south of the island, and the mailboat was conscripted twice throughout the course of the war. And so there were a lot of ways that the war really hit home here on Monhegan. And if you're interested in seeing this online exhibition, it's on our website now. It's at www.monheganmuseum.org/WWII. And it's photographs and oral histories and paintings and just a really all-encompassing view of those years on Monhegan. But in addition to Captain Bratton, tonight we also have Earl Shuttleworth. So we have two very important Maine historians with us this evening. And Earl has been active in historic preservation in Maine for over 50 years, and he served as our state historian since 2004. He's a treasured member of the Monhegan Museum's Board of Trustees, and he'll be introducing Captain Bratton for us this evening. But before we start, I just want to go over a few technical details. We are recording tonight's presentation, so it'll be available on our website in just a few days. We invite you to use the chat feature to let us know where you're joining from and to say hello, but please use the question and answer feature for your questions, and we'll pose those to Captain Bratton or Earl if necessary at the end of the presentation. So thank you again for joining us, and over to you, Earl.
Well, thank you very much, Jen. It's a great pleasure to introduce Captain Jonathan Bratton. He is the command historian for the Maine National Guard. In this capacity, he has produced multiple articles on the history of Maine soldiers, appearing in such publications as the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Army History. He has also appeared in the Smithsonian Channel documentary, Americans Underground, Secret Cities of World War I, and has served as an historian in France for the Army's World War I centennial celebration. His book, To the Last Man, a National Guard Regiment in the Great War, 1917 to 1919, was published in the summer of 2020 by the Army University Press. Captain Bratton has been selected as the Army Center of Military History Scholar in Residence at the U.S. Military Academy, West Point, and will report there next month. Although he's promised us that eventually he will come back to Maine and resume his work here. I can just say from a personal standpoint that it has been a pleasure over these recent years to know and work with Jonathan. He's a very committed historian and scholar. He was a great help to me as state historian during the celebration in 2017 and 18 of the 100th anniversary of World War I, and I know that he'll have a wonderful presentation for us about World War II tonight. Jonathan.
Well, thank you so much, Earl. Well, it's speechless after that. Thank you. I really appreciate it, and thank you all for joining us as we take a little time to talk about Maine in World War II, which is a very difficult thing to do with, as Earl and I were talking about earlier, somewhere between 90 to 95,000 Mainers served in World War II, both at home and abroad. And it would take a little bit longer than an hour to talk about the service of those 95,000 people. So we're going to bring it down to about 4,500 individuals in the Maine National Guard in World War II who would see service at home and in each theater of the war. And it gives us a little bit of a snapshot. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen right now. All right, well, thank you again for joining me in this lecture on the role played by the Maine National Guard in World War II. This is the war that would see the Maine National Guard, World War I saw the Maine National Guard thrown overseas into Europe for the first time. World War II saw the Maine Guard flung across the entire globe, from Iceland to New Guinea, from Portland to Belgium. And so we'll talk about the various experiences that the different organizations of the Maine National Guard had, as well as looking at the photographs from this era to really grasp the enormity of it all. To begin with, we need to define what the Maine National Guard was in 1940. Following World War I, there began a period of rebuilding the National Guard and the state's military structure following the Great War. It wasn't until 1921, in fact, that the state really began reorganizing these old units going all the way back to several of them, the 1700s and the 1800s. Due to the way that the federal laws worked at this time, when the National Guard was federalized in 1917, so going from state service to federal service. I'm sorry, my cat has decided to join the lecture. The units and soldiers they left the National Guard service. So they left state service, entered federal service. And when they were discharged in 1919, they were entirely discharged. They left, there was nothing left of the state service. They did not go from a federal status back to a state status. So there's really nothing left of the National Guard following World War I. And it would take years and years to rebuild the National Guard to what it had been. And it was a valuable lesson that was never repeated. So units and soldiers would return to state status following all subsequent mobilizations. In 1921, the state's largest entity, the 103rd Infantry Regiment, formerly the 2nd Maine Infantry Regiment prior to World War I, with roots going all the way back to the 2nd Maine of the Civil War, was reestablished as an infantry regiment in the Maine National Guard, with companies all across the state, but with headquarters in Portland. In the 13 companies of Coast Artillery were reorganized into the 240th Coast Artillery Regiment. And in 1922, the state added an entirely new organization, the 152nd Field Artillery Regiment. Both the 152nd Field Artillery and the 103rd Infantry were part of the overall 43rd Infantry Division of the National Guard. There were two National Guard divisions in New England at the time, the 26th Division in mostly Massachusetts, and the 43rd Division pretty much taking everybody else, with headquarters in Rhode Island, and with units across Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Rhode Island as well. And so these are going to be the units that we follow. So the 240th Coast Artillery, their crest is there in the middle, and they had companies across southern Maine, coastal, and even up into Rockland. It was configured as a harbor defense regiment, serving in concert with the 8th Coast Artillery Regiment, which was a regular Army unit stationed in the harbor defenses of Portland. Its unit insignia denotes its ties to Portland, with the phoenix rising from the ashes and the portcullis indicating the gateway to the state. The 10 campaign stars are those campaigns of the 1st, 10th, and 29th Maine Volunteer Infantry Regiments in the Civil War, with the motto, "Always first and faithful." This regiment could trace its history all the way back to those early 1800s in militia service, and with some of the companies dating back to the 1700s. The state's next oldest unit was the 103rd Infantry Regiment, with their crest to the far right there, with companies across northern, central, and western Maine. Tracing its lineage, as I said, back to the 2nd Maine Infantry of the Civil War days, the 103rd's crest harkens back to that flag, with the blue saltire taken from the rebel flag, since so many rebel flags were captured by the regiment. It carries on it 8 fleurs-de-lis for its 8 World War I campaigns, and its regimental motto of "To the last man" is also from the Great War. And then the newest organization of the Maine National Guard that existed in 1940, the 152nd Field Artillery, composed of 2 battalions of artillery, the first being all in Aroostook County, and the second being from Bangor and Brewer. Organized in 1922, this was a largely untested organization that was eager to make a name for itself. Its motto, "On the Way," came from the Battery Fire Direction Center command that announced when a fire mission was underway. Through the 1930s, the Maine National Guard played a role in labor relations developments that were happening across the country, as there were, of course, a series of strikes in Maine in 1934 and 1938. The 103rd played minor roles in both of these. The attitudes of labor leaders, strike leaders, and the Guard leaders was sort of to keep things as amicable as possible, keep the Guard out of it as much as possible, and avoid a lot of the ugly scenes that were really being enacted in other states around the country. Still, you do get pictures such as this of Guardsmen patrolling picket lines like those seen here in Guilford in 1934. The Guard was also active, as it always had been, in response to any type of natural disaster, such as the fires in New Auburn and the flooding in, I believe, in 1933, and the flooding rather in Augusta, also in the 1930s. Other major development going on were a series of military maneuvers and exercises that began in the 1930s. Some of these were local to New England, as this great newspaper clipping says, opening phase of Maine's war with Vermont tonight. So the Maine and Vermont having some friendly rivalry there. These were where soldiers of the 43rd Division from northern New England and Rhode Island and Connecticut vied with each other. They also participated in large-scale maneuvers where the 43rd Infantry Division was part of a much larger exercise, most held at Pine Camp, New York, now known as Fort Drum, or at Plattsburgh, New York. And in 1935, there were actually 35,000 troops assembled at Pine Camp, one of the largest peacetime maneuvers in the US up to that point. 1939 saw even larger maneuvers in New York, with troops from Maine making the long convoy there in motor trucks, which I cannot imagine. That must have been, there were many stops along the way. And why was this happening? US leaders were no dummies. General George C. Marshall assumed the position of Army Chief of Staff on September 1st, 1939, the same day that Germany invaded Poland. I would argue that Marshall is one of the greatest thinkers to ever wear Army green. And he set about to put the Army in readiness for war as much as possible with a limited defense budget. He had 2 priorities then, testing new doctrine and equipment on a large scale, which he would do in regional maneuvers in 1940, and then the general headquarters maneuvers in 1941, which we'll talk about in a minute. The other priority in 1940 was bolstering Great Britain, then in the throes of the Battle of Britain, left alone after the fall of France. So presuming the fall of Britain, Marshall authorized the mobilization of the coastal defense units of the National Guard in 1940 and early 1941. Congress approved this, as well as approving a peacetime draft in 1941. September of 1940 saw the 240th Coast Artillery called up to federal service, and its ranks filled with draftees to bring it up to wartime strength. Thus, these approximately 1,000 Mainers would be the first called up for wartime service, and they would be serving, as you can see, right here at home. And you might be asking yourself at this juncture, what even is coast artillery? Well, simply put, It's large guns, very big guns, really big guns, like these 12-inch guns of Battery Blair at Fort Williams, pictured here, able to fire out to sea from 17 to 27 kilometers. These were first constructed in the 1890s in response to war with Spain, but the fortifications and lately modernized, but the fortifications at Williams, Forts Williams, Fort Preble, Fort McKinley, Fort Scammell, and Fort Baldwin covered the approaches to the harbor of Portland and the mouth of the Kennebec. The other thing the Coast Artillery had were sea mines, seen here in a mine planting vessel in Casco Bay. Yes, the Army did and still does have many, many boats. But these sea mines and anti-submarine nets guarded the harbor and were controlled from two places, one at Fort Williams, the other on Peaks Island. These underwater defenses of Portland Harbor were just as imposing as those above water, if invisible to the naked eye. Mines protected the major approaches, while hydrophones, which were basically underwater listening devices, were placed at key points. At the exterior of the harbor mouth, the Navy used what were called anti-submarine loops, which were essentially electric cables placed in the water with their resistance set to neutral. An approaching submarine would cause their currents to begin flowing, indicating the exact spot where the submarine was. These loops had been developed in the United Kingdom and were sometimes connected to remotely controlled minefields as well. So really advanced technology. And so now this tech was being used in the United States, with Navy loops spreading from Two Lights all the way out to Bailey Island. But why Portland? Well, Portland is the largest deep water port closest to Europe and the US. It was also at the time a major rail hub connecting the Midwest to the Northeast and to Canada as well. It became the home then of the North Atlantic destroyer fleet once the US entered the war. And of course, with Liberty ships being built in South Portland, it was also the site of massive shipping and logistics enterprises. The Navy maintained several training schools in Portland as well. And this is a great newspaper clipping for rules in the case of an air raid in Portland. I like the never throw water on an incendiary bomb. That's a good life lesson for everybody. But it's a good reminder. I like to show this because we often think of the war as this far off and remote thing. But in the weeks and months following Pearl Harbor, coastal cities across the US felt a very, very real danger. During the war, the defenses were modified as the overall threat changed. The large, static, heavy guns were largely removed and replaced with mobile batteries of field guns, like these 155 millimeter guns firing at Portland Headlight. It's always a sort of shocking image to see the most photographed lighthouse in the world and these weapons of war surrounding it. More anti-aircraft batteries with searchlights were placed around the harbor defenses, an indicator that really the threat was now going to be coming from the air and not so much from the sea. And anti-torpedo motorboat batteries of quad-mounted machine guns were placed around Fort Williams and Peaks Island to cover the main approaches to Casco Bay. The sort of coup de grace were two massive 16-inch guns placed on Peaks Island to reach out those 15, 20 miles to strike any vessel that might be foolish enough to approach. By 1944, it was already realized that those would not be needed and they were cut up for scrap by 1945. But of course, for those who have been out to Peaks before, you can see the emplacements still. And Casco Bay and surrounding areas of coastal Maine really do bear tribute to the Coast Artillery tradition and the harbor defense tradition in Maine. Life for soldiers of the 240th was one of boredom and routine mixed with brief moments of excitement. Sports leagues, dances, and proximity to Portland helped ease the monotony. Drills and exercises with the Navy helped liven things up as well, as did, the constant threat of German U-boats. Merchant and war shipping off Maine's coast made lucrative U-boat targets. One Wolfpack in particular operated off Casco Bay and ranged all the way up to Bar Harbor. It was one of these torpedoes that struck patrol boat Eagle 56 on April 23rd, 1945, as it was towing targets for Navy bomber practice off Cape Elizabeth. Out of a crew of 62, only 13 survived. USS Selfridge, a nearby destroyer, picked up the survivors and dropped depth charges at a well-profiled sonar image. The survivors described seeing a conning tower with markings that matched U-853, a U-boat which was sunk off Rhode Island about 2 weeks later. Up until 2001, the Navy was calling this a boiler explosion until they finally released the files and issued Purple Hearts to survivors and families. On February 24th, 1941, all units of the 43rd Infantry Division were activated for 1 year of federal service. So the companies and the batteries of the 103rd Infantry and the 152nd Field Artillery reported then to their armories across the state, from as far south as Biddeford to as far north as Fort Kent. After several days, and you can see these are photos from those cold February mornings. The photo on the left there is Company C of the 103rd Infantry boarding their transportation in Norway, and then Company K reporting for duty in Belfast. After several days in the armories, the trains began to roll towards Portland, bringing the thousands of men together where they were packed into the old Milk Street Armory, the Portland Expo, and other venues, pretty much wherever they could pack soldiers in, mostly sleeping on cots. They were led by Colonel Spalding Bisbee, a veteran of World War I, and also a prominent lawyer in the region. The 103rd Infantry at the time was a combination of grizzled Great War veterans and then kids like Buxton's Harold Smith, who joined Westbrook's Company D in 1939 because, well, it seemed fun. Joined on December 7th, 1939. An odd omen, as I talked with him about. By trains and trucks, the units then made the long movement south in March to Camp Blanding, Florida. And it was here that they began taking in draftees and began a period of intensive instruction, first at the individual level, then the squad, platoon, company, and battalion. The reason for this activation, which was only supposed to be for 1 year, and that's how it goes in the Army. They say 1 year and then it turns into 4. But this activation, along with nearly every other National Guard division in the US, before the nation was even involved in the conflict, was precisely to prevent the very blundering way, haphazard way that the US Army went into World War I, which still was an improvement over how the US Army went into the Spanish-American War, so slowly developing. The goal was to put every division, 22,000 men in each division, through successive training events, culminating in these massive maneuvers, the General Headquarters maneuvers in July and August, commonly known today as the Louisiana maneuvers. Now, the entire exercise was massive. Over 350,000 troops all over Louisiana, all the way to the maneuver area that spread to the Texas border towards the Red River. This was followed by large maneuvers in the Carolinas, also in the fall in North Carolina, and southern North Carolina and northern South Carolina. Got to get those right. To the higher ups, this was a grand spectacle and testing doctrine and strategy and things like that. To those soldiers on the ground, it was an often confusing, bewildering, and frustrating time period. There were complex sets of rules that everyone needed to know. One soldier in the 152nd Field Artillery related an incident where he watched an infantry squad approach a bridge that was marked blown up. The squad leader paused for a second and then led his men marching over it. "Hey, you can't do that," said the umpire. "Can't you see the bridge is blown up?" "Sure can," said the NCO calmly. "Can't you see we're swimming?" Incidents like these really took away a lot of the seriousness of these maneuvers. Regional differences too began to show as someone had a bright idea to pit the Yankees of the 43rd Infantry Division against the 31st Infantry Division, nicknamed the Dixie Division. So you know that was going to go well. All Southern troops, and the local Southern papers boasted about their boys beating up on those Yanks once again, until Colonel Bisbee just couldn't take it anymore. In the next phase of the maneuvers, he mounted up 2 battalions and trucks against the enemy, and then sent his 3rd one around them at night, marching on foot all night long. The maneuver completely took the enemy by surprise and actually captured their division command post. An officer at Corps headquarters inquired who had pulled off a crazy stunt like this, and the reply came, "Oh, the foot cavalry from Maine, of course." And just as it seemed that things were going to be heading towards a conclusion in this 1-year activation, of course, as everyone was getting ready for Christmas leave, on December 7th, Pearl Harbor was attacked, and the United States entered World War II. So all leaves and furloughs were immediately canceled. Married men with dependents were discharged, and the whole tenor of everything begins to change. The first thing that happens early in 1942 is that the 43rd Infantry Division moves to Camp Shelby, Mississippi, and undergoes a transformation. It goes from 4 infantry regiments to 3, and the field artillery were broken up into independent battalions. What does this mean? It means that the division shrinks down to about 15,000 troops to make it more manageable in combat. And what that means for the Maine folks is that they now begin to separate and break out. There was no change to the 103rd Infantry, but dramatic changes to the 152nd Field Artillery. The 1st Battalion, the County Boys, are removed from the division and become the 203rd Field Artillery Battalion. More on them later. The 2nd Battalion from Bangor becomes the 152nd Field Artillery Battalion, which causes no end of confusion to people like me when we're trying to do research and you just see a number and you don't see the other designator. The Army is nothing if not always confusing. The 152nd Field Artillery Battalion from Bangor and Brewer was teamed up with the 103rd Infantry to form what was called the 103rd Regimental Combat Team. The idea being that each battalion within the 103rd could be paired with one of the batteries of the 152nd and thereby operate as its own little independent task force. After some more training, and I can definitely say I mobilized for Afghanistan out of Camp Shelby. That picture on the right looks exactly like it did in 2013, so not much has changed there. And on the left there, you have the governors of the New England states reviewing the troops, including Maine Governor Sumner Sewell, who is 3rd from the right there in the dark suit jacket, looking away from the camera, himself a veteran of the Great War, an ace, which I always think is an imposing thing when your governor is a fighter ace. But after some more training, their first stop, after heading to California, they board ships, and their first stop is in New Zealand, disembarking October 22nd, 1942 in Auckland as a New Zealand band played the Maine Stein song, which was incidentally the regimental march. The division was here to protect the islands and Australia from any attempted push by the Japanese to seize New Zealand and Australia. Following this, the division moved to New Caledonia 1 month later, and there continued to be a train up through early 1943 with a special emphasis on amphibious landings. So by this point in the war in the Pacific, the US strategy, they've agreed that they would have even though we were drawn into the war in the Pacific against the Japanese, we agreed with the Allies, with Great Britain and the Soviet Union, that we were going to have a Germany first strategy. So we would prosecute the war in Germany. That would be our main emphasis, with just keeping up enough pressure on the Japanese to essentially make moderate progress. But what this meant was that in the Pacific, they were not always getting all the best equipment and all the best troops and timely resupply as they were in Europe, with most things focused on the war in Europe. By 1943, the first actions have taken place on Guadalcanal down there in the south in the Solomon Islands, and the strategy is taking place that there are going to be two routes across the Pacific. There'll be the Central Pacific and there will be the South Pacific, and that's where we're going to focus on the South Pacific because that's where the 43rd Infantry Division was sent. A lot of people don't think of the Pacific as being the Army's theater. Well, there were about 26 Army divisions 29 Army divisions in the Pacific theater in comparison to the 9 Marine Corps divisions. So a lot of Army in the Pacific theater. The Solomon Islands become a larger stepping stone towards New Guinea, and then towards shielding Australia, and then towards the Philippines, with the overall goal of retaking the Philippines that had been abandoned, and then striking the Japanese home island. So it's an island hopping campaign. The 103rd and the 152nd will land on Guadalcanal in February of 1943, taking fire for the first time on February 17th from a Japanese air raid. They would then move to seize the Russell Islands, their first amphibious landings, which were unopposed as the Japanese had just recently evacuated the islands. The first combat landings of the regiment are going to take place in June of 1943, when the 43rd Infantry Division, along with Marine Raider Battalion, several Navy assets, are given the mission to reduce the island of New Georgia. It's the next island in the Solomon Island chain. The 103rd Regimental Combat Team will conduct 2 initial landings to get support beachheads on the island alongside Marine Raider detachments. The overall objective is Munda Point, there on the northwestern part of the island of New Georgia, and to seize the airfield there. We're looking at about 10,000 Japanese soldiers defending the island, with a lot of enemy aircraft flying support missions from nearby islands as well. This first introduction to combat was tough and very unforgiving. But the soldiers of the 103rd caught some breaks. Company G from Waterville on the night of June 30th managed to catch 2 Japanese barges full of reinforcements trying to land on New Georgia. The machine guns and automatic rifles tore into the barges, essentially leaving no survivors. And this is a photo of one of these the next day. However, as the operations on New Georgia continued into July, the heat, the humidity, the situation of fighting in the jungle began to really take its toll. Most of the action was small unit based, but the jungle itself was its own enemy, especially to those individuals who are not familiar with living sort of out in the woods. And so as it happened, the 103rd soldiers were less likely to succumb to a lot of the sort of terrors of the jungle than were those soldiers from southern New England. And Vermont soldiers as well were similarly managed to develop a little bit better of immunity. But tied to this jungle terror of those first opening days was this terror of the Japanese as well, because of their tactics. So just imagine this: you've advanced through the jungle, which is itself terrifying. It's this unknown place. You never know what the next bit of coral is going to be hiding, or the next bunch of bushes or trees. And you dug your foxhole for the night, and you're sharing that with your buddy. The next morning you wake up and someone has killed your buddy and left you alive. which is absolutely terrifying for those soldiers who did fall asleep. The next night, you're ensuring that that's not going to happen again. Soldiers would link arms, holding knives or pistols with hand grenades at the ready, and prolonged periods of exhaustion from fighting all day and staying awake all night would really take their toll. In addition, Japanese soldiers would, who were English speakers, would who had identified the division, would shout out familiar things about New England and maybe anecdotes from the Louisiana maneuvers that they'd picked up from either newspapers or just listening to U.S. soldiers. And this created cases of war neurosis. In fact, the 43rd Infantry Division would have the highest numbers of war neurosis cases of one division in the U.S. Army in World War II. War neurosis, slightly limited to, or slightly connected to PTSD, but more in the moment. It could be easily treated in the moment. They eventually found out the two best treatments were taking the soldier off the front line, not too far back, but enough to get him a safe night's sleep in a warm bed, a bath or a shower, something like that, and also victory. Victory was a quick cure to this, but it tended to very much wear on these soldiers. So these are soldiers of Company C from Norway, and you can see the look on the face of the point man there, just that 1,000-yard stare from fighting the elements and fighting the enemy themselves. By mid-July, this operation had begun to suck in even more troops. The 37th Division from the Ohio National Guard was brought in because the Japanese defense was just so tenacious. And so you've got about now 30,000 troops operating on this very small island, driving forward towards Munda Point. The 3rd Battalion of the 103rd landed at Leana Beach on July 14th. And on the 22nd, the 2nd Battalion landed as well. And so these two battalions pushed inland day by day. You can see just, each day they're inching forward, really measuring in yards. So very much almost like World War I combat. They're developing, and it is through tactical innovation of using artillery and infantry and tanks together and flamethrowers that they're able to reduce these successive lines of enemy defenses that are built into these strong pillbox positions. This is Harold Slager, University of Maine graduate. He was an officer in the 152nd Field Artillery Regiment from Bangor. And as he was actually on a reconnaissance mission, and a force of Japanese soldiers landed just adjacent to him, and then to knock out the division command post on Rendova Island. Rather than run away, he stayed and observed them, and then was able to radio back the enemy position to give the command post enough time to defend itself. He was eventually spotted and killed in action, decorated with the Distinguished Service Cross. Just one of many heroic Mainers in this group. The guns of the 152nd Field Artillery provided fire support deep in the jungle, as this great photo demonstrates. They were placed on locations on several islands, and the improved tactical cooperation between the infantry and field artillery defeated a lot of the special Japanese tactics, where they would attempt to get close to US lines to avoid the artillery barrage. And so, recognizing this, the infantry would fall back, the artillery would fire, the Japanese would advance out of their positions to get very close to the Americans' old positions. And then the artillery would fire on the Americans' old positions now. So thinking this was a tactic that was developed specifically by these main units working together to survive out here in these very wretched conditions. Casualties mounted during the operation, and other than that first level of care that they might receive on the island, anything further had to go out via water. So that first from the point of wound, you might be pulled back by a medic to a battalion or company or battalion aid station. If the wound is bad enough, you'd be placed in a jeep, driven over the rocky and bumpy roads of the island to one of the harbors, loaded on a boat such as this, brought back to a destroyer, hoisted up the side of a destroyer, and then finally brought to either a hospital ship or a hospital on another or safer island. So really, there is no sort of immediate rest for these individuals. From these photos, you have this wonderful photo of sort of on the left there, Sergeant Levesque and Private Whitman on New Georgia. Just a moment of sharing that brief soldier's respite, mail from home, and that brief glance at life as it was as normal. Private Whitman would actually be killed in action on Luzon 2 years later. And then Omar Pomerleau from Skowhegan in Company L, killed in action by a sniper. Just some examples of the losses that began to strike the regiment, and so that especially this early on, with most of the soldiers being of a Maine background, the more casualties they took, the more draftees that came in who were not from Maine or New England, and sort of lessened the ties to home and community. Finally, on August 5th, the 3rd Battalion broke through and seized Munda Airfield. This is a great photo of some of the soldiers on Munda Airfield in one of the giant holes left by US bombs. And you can see from the photo, these are veterans. These are combat veterans. They are very confident. They are sure in who they are. They have some great beards going on in that photo. But New Georgia and Munda are really, they are the baptism of fire of the unit. And speaking with veterans after the war, speaking with their family members, for soldiers in the 43rd Division and the 37th Division, they mentioned Munda with a feeling of grudging respect and a little bit of horror mixed in there, because it was such a hard fight, and because so many soldiers were lost there. From here, thankfully, they get a bit of a rest, and I think they deserve it. They went back to New Zealand for some R&R and to get replacements. And then by 1944, they're in New Guinea, which is a much larger island, almost always in combat. From not much is going on there, really, in a grand scheme of things for the division. More training, patrolling along the Drianmore River, knocking out small pockets of Japanese, eliminating resistance around the island. These are the 152nd Field Artillery firing once again. And I just want to invite the comparison between the two photos, the one that we saw earlier of them in the jungle, sort of stripped to the waist, and everyone's dirty, bearded. Here, it's very much, they're tense. They're sort of living in a garrison lifestyle. Even though they're still firing on the enemy, they're having to wear their leggings again and their helmets and all the regulations of the Army at play again. And then on Christmas Day, 1944, they're loaded up on transports from New Guinea and made the trip to Lingayen Gulf off the Philippine island of Luzon, Luzon being the largest of the Philippine islands. Now, of course, the Philippines had to have been abandoned in 1942, saw the largest American surrender ever, and MacArthur vowing that we would return. So this January 9th, 1945 is a very significant day, marking the return of the US and the Allies to Luzon. January 9th was D-Day for this operation. And I'll use Second Lieutenant Edward Ho from C Company of the 103rd to describe what he saw that day. He said, we all got in the boats and we went through the big battleships in the back and they were firing. Then we went through the cruisers and they were firing. And then we went through the destroyers and they were firing. And then we went through this, and then they had those things that shot like rockets. And then through those, and then we got closer and the machine guns were firing. The 103rd Regimental Combat Team was given the role of landing at White Beach 3 on January 9th and began advancing inland. The landings were largely unopposed. The Japanese had decided to pull their forces back rather than have them suffer from the heavy aerial and naval bombardment preceding the invasion. They pulled back to the higher ground. And this is Sergeant J. Gruenfeld's words in Company L. And he writes, "The Amtrak ground to shore and let down its ramp on White Beach 3, adjacent to the town of San Fabian. It was 9:40. We clambered off and instantly sank into the fine sand. I was in the best shape of my life, yet the 70-pound load I was carrying made it difficult to move forward. I had 4 bandoliers of ammunition, plus a clip in my rifle, 3 or 4 grenades, 3 days worth of K rations, water-filled canteens, a bazooka shell which weighed several pounds, and a couple 60mm mortar rounds. Hill 200 would be our company's first objective, and we passed through San Fabian's rubble and started down the San Jacinto Road in order to get there." It gives you just an idea of what it's like to make that movement inland there. Opposition began to stiffen as the ground rose, and they began to be subjected to artillery and mortar fire. Soldiers of the regiment crossing these streams that laced the rice paddies in that coastal area as they moved inland, securing the town of San Fabian, and then striking their first opposition at Hill 200, which took 5 days of pounding with artillery and mortars and then infantry action with flamethrowers to finally subdue. The next up was Hill 600. This is, I believe, also Company H from Waterville with their mortars going into action. Hill 600 was a tall height filled with tunnels and trenches. So they took it in stages, working their way up a day or two at a time. And the battle for Hill 600 would actually last for the better part of 2 weeks. On January 22nd, the 3rd Battalion of the 103rd was holding a commander's meeting when their command post actually got hit by Japanese artillery fire, killing and wounding nearly all of the leaders, the company and battalion leadership, including Bernard Bertels from Bangor, a Bowdoin graduate, seen here, who had been an insurance investigator in civilian life, killed in action here on January 22nd. Finally, they took Hill 600 and then had to fight off fanatical Japanese counterattacks through January. January 26th and 27th brought strong Japanese counterattacks with armor, which were beaten back with dozens of Japanese casualties. Finally, February brought a rest after 174 men of the regiment had been killed in action and hundreds more wounded. But after about a 2-week rest in February, they were back at it, this time clearing ridges and mountaintops filled with enemy troops. Fighting was slow, but constant patrols were always running into gun battles. This lasted from March all the way through April. Constant pushes through mountain passes to cut off enemy lines of retreat and supply lines. Very arduous task, fighting often at heights of 1,200 to 1,500 feet up in the mountains, slowly advancing through valleys and ridge lines, engaging in fights in tunnels, often in the darkness, oftentimes just a squad or two off on their own. Here you see medics at a dressing station medics from the company from Millinocket. At a dressing station in the push to take Mount Tenawan, which is about a 1,200 feet high peak. On May 1st, the 103rd got a new priority mission, seizing the Ipoh Dam outside of Manila. Now, the Ipoh Dam provided 70% of the water to Manila, was high up in the mountains. Japanese had actually targeted it for destruction. And you can imagine what sort of a humanitarian nightmare that would be in Luzon if the city were to lose 70% of its water including, Luzon was undergoing significant destruction due to the fighting, or I'm sorry, not Luzon, Manila, the city of Manila. Manila saw heavy fighting, but it would have been an absolute disaster if they had lost their water supply. Aiding in this attack, aiding the 103rd in this attack were units of Filipino guerrillas. The Filipino guerrillas were really just they're unsung heroes, really. They fought all through this campaign, led by Allied officers giving U.S. weapons. You can see here soldiers from the 103rd issuing weapons to the guerrillas. Many of them were prior Philippine soldiers who were in the U.S. Army prior to the invasion, who had, after the Japanese occupation, had fled into the jungle and were fighting alongside also U.S. soldiers who had escaped as well. Many civilians lent their aid there. They fed intelligence back to the Allies all throughout the 1940s, all throughout the war, culminating in this invasion. And one of the very sad things is that following the war, they really did not receive any recognition. It would not be until the 1990s that they began to receive, the families and a few of the veterans who are still alive began to receive the recognition that they were deserved from the US government. This advance was through the Ipoh Dam, was through incredibly rough terrain, massive air operations. 250,000 tons of napalm were used to support the 43rd Infantry Division in this operation. Naturally, it rained as they went through the mountains. There were suicide squads of Japanese attacking them in banzai charges, fought off during the night by the companies from Biddeford and Westbrook. By May 20th, they had seized the dam intact, eliminated the Japanese resistance around it, and linked up with Marking's guerrilla regiment that had been approaching from the north. This largely ended operations on Luzon. About 205 men killed in action on Luzon for the 103rd, while killing about 4,000 of the enemy. By this point, they had become a highly lethal force. This is a photo of I believe it's the Lewiston, the Biddeford company. And they're seen here with what were originally labeled as Japanese soldiers. Came to find out later, these are slave laborers from Manchuria who had been taken by the Japanese and were being used here on the island of Luzon. They're being captured, and the Americans are sharing their K rations with them, just following the seizure of Ipoh Dam. The regiment continued to patrol through August on Luzon, but they were still in training for that next step, the invasion of the Japanese home islands. The men trained, officers studied maps and plans, they anticipated massive casualties. But then came the atomic bombs, and Japan surrendered on September 2nd. They still had to go to Japan anyway, but this was for occupation duty in Yokohama. So this is one of the medics of the 103rd getting off the transport in Japan with a smile on his face under much happier circumstances than they ever envisioned arriving there. They were on occupation duty around Tokyo until September 29th. And then those soldiers that were left who had not been sent home embarked on ships and headed to San Francisco, arriving under the Golden Gate Bridge in October. And the unit was inactivated that same month in 1945. So many of these men were now arriving home for the first time since February of 1941. Just absolutely astonishing to think of being gone that long. Meanwhile, back in France, what had been the 2nd Battalion of the 152nd Field Artillery, as I mentioned, became the 203rd Field Artillery Battalion. The 203rd, so these are the Aroostook County boys. They went through training in the US through 1942, 1943, and they arrived in England in early 1944. Of course, at this time, everything is building up for the big push. There's been fighting in North Africa in 1942, the invasion of Italy and Sicily in 1943. But by 1944, you're looking at breaking through into Fortress Europe with the operations on June 6th, D-Day. And June 6th happens, and just 16 days later, on D+16 on June 25th, the 203rd lands on Utah and Omaha beaches in Normandy, and almost immediately begins firing. They're supporting advancing infantry of usually the 30th Infantry Division, the old Hickory Division from Tennessee, trying to break the German lines in the hedgerows, also firing against German artillery. On July 4th, I thought this was an interesting little note, but on July 4th, every gun in the Army fired one round all at once at noon to celebrate Independence Day. That's a uniquely American thing to do, it feels like. The battalion was routinely targeted by German artillery, routinely strafed by German aircraft as well, as they began to move across France. It wasn't all bad. They got to see Bob Hope, pictured here in a rather blurry photo, but on his USO tour. They also made their own fun. This is from a soldier's collection from Battery B, which is originally from Holton. They had an Italian soldier who had been basically a prisoner of war who sort of joined them, deciding to just help out, and he played the accordion. And of course, somebody got his accordion and decided to have their own fun there. And apparently he also taught them cribbage, but I highly doubt that he taught them cribbage, given that these are young men from Aroostook County who learned cribbage at a very young age, probably at their grandmother's knees. I would imagine it was the other way around, that they taught him cribbage. Through 1944, the battalion supported infantry assaults against strong points like the city of Metz in France, and then pushed the Germans out of France completely. Then moving into Belgium, where they fired thousands of rounds at the siege of Aachen. Pictured here is one of the big 155 millimeter howitzers that the battalion used. The constant cleaning and maintenance of these guns took up a lot of time. But then in December, Germans launched a counterattack, driving through the Ardennes forest in the famous Battle of the Bulge. And the 203rd was one of those units that was called upon to rush from their sector that they were in into the Bulge to be able to help stop this massive German penetration, the last great German counterattack of the war. So the battalion quickly moved south from Belgium all the way down to the Rotgen forest on the north end of the Bulge, where they gave us this amazing pic. I mean, there is almost nothing more Maine than this photo of guys with Aroostook County soldiers with a crosscut saw in the woods, building their firing emplacements in one of these one of the most noteworthy battles of the war. And they were firing nearly constantly every single day. On December 24th, the combat log of Battery B wrote, if Jerry hung out his stocking, we filled it with high explosives. That was how they noted Christmas Eve. Following the Battle of the Bulge and the successful repulse of the Germans, they crossed the Rhine into Germany at the beginning of 1945. By the end of the war, they were so mobile that they were practically up in the front on the leading edge of their own tanks. They crossed briefly into Holland and then Germany, and they were in the war really right up to the last minutes, and then serving as part of the occupation force in Germany. They proudly say in their history, they fired more than 68,000 rounds at the enemy, equaling 3,200 tons of metal, and traveled 1,450 miles across France. Very different type of war than those who saw the operations in the Pacific, sort of more the World War II that we're sort of used to seeing and taking place in these wide open areas in Europe. And so, of course, arriving in 1944, they really just had those nearly just about 10 months of combat before the Germans surrendered just around this time in 1945. Approximately 4,500 Maine Guard members served in World War II. We don't know the exact numbers. We don't know exactly their losses either, as there were no good records developed after the war, as there had been with World War I and the Civil War. But with the Guard came back home again. And an untold portion of this story that should be added, I should probably add this for future lectures, is the Maine State Guard and the story of the 3,000 Maine State Guardsmen, many of them older veterans of the Great War who still wanted to do their part, who formed units all across Maine while the National Guard was called up to be held at readiness for home defense, civil unrest, or disasters such as fires or flooding, the traditional roles of the National Guard. The Maine State Guard, interestingly, was our first, really the first integrated force, racially integrated force since the Continental Army in Maine, where the Continental Army and the Massachusetts militia did not have, well, the Massachusetts militia did not have rules on race, so there were many African Americans and Native Americans who served in Maine units in the American Revolution. The Continental Army would eventually say no African Americans, and then allowed African Americans to serve. Most units largely ignored that and kept the soldiers serving. But of course, the Army would then segregate all the way through until after World War II. But in the Maine State Guard, the regulations just stipulated nothing about race. And it wasn't until someone from Calais sent me a photo of one of the State Guard companies marching through Calais, and I saw that it was a integrated company, and I realized that I went back to look at the regulations, and once again, you know, Maine often does its own thing, and a neat bit of history there. The Maine Guard came back home again. A great photo of the colors in front of the Maine State House, just following the return of the regiments. And many of the veterans stayed in, rising through the ranks, and with some not retiring until the 1970s after 30 years of service. Incidentally, just as the Maine Guard was reforming in 1946 and 47, Maine was struck by, in 1947, the massive fires that struck southern Maine, Bar Harbor, Mount Desert, and this was these veterans put on the uniform once again, and went out there and fought fires for several weeks. So whether they protected the homeland, served in the Pacific or Europe, Maine Guard soldiers undoubtedly left their mark on World War II. So thank you for joining me in this brief snippet of Maine in World War II. Of course, there's the Navy story, there's the Army Air Corps story, there's the Coast Guard story. The stories could go on and on. We could stay here for a long period of time. We could talk about all the Medal of Honor recipients from Maine, including Ed Dahlgren, the potato seed inspector from Aroostook County, who basically took a town in Germany by himself, and so many more. But time is limited, so I'll go ahead and stop the screen sharing right here and welcome any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Just making sure that was amazing. So many powerful stories, and to think of these young men from Maine, and when you say the towns, you know, it really brings it home that these are young men like we all would have known, and the experiences that they were taken to from the relatively sheltered upbringing in Maine. And once I realized that they were with other young men from Maine, it made me, you know, think about how that must have brought some comfort, that they had so much in common that they could talk about, at least at the beginning. But such powerful images, and beginning with those of, you know, our iconic Portland headlight with artillery in front of it, just really, really powerful. Thank you. And we welcome people to put questions in the Q&A. We do have one here from Charles in Stratford, Connecticut, and he said he experienced World War II on Malta and thought it was odd that the rules for civilians appeared to make no mention of air raid shelters. Were there any in Maine?
Earl, do you want to handle that one? I've seen signs for them, but a lot of them were those civil defense signs that the Civil Defense Force formed following World War II.
Yeah, I'm not sure to what extent formal air raid shelters were built. However, I do think that it was definitely a strategy to have those signs on public buildings and large commercial buildings and so on, so that in case there had been an air raid shelter, people would go to the basements of those buildings for shelter. I know in my own experience, and some of our listeners will remember this as well, you know, I was born in 1948 and I started going to school when I was 4 years old to an old brick Victorian school in Portland. And we had air raid drills in which it was either you quickly went under your desk, but more so you were trooped down to the granite foundation basement of the building and stayed there for, you know, X number of minutes while the air raid drill ran on. I also remember from a personal experience, my parents built their house in Portland in 1940-41. In fact, they just finished it before the war began. And when I was growing up in the late 40s and the early 50s, they still had the air raid curtains, the dark, the either black or deep green pull shades for both the windows of the first and second story as well as the basement. And it was just the idea that you know, if there was a threat of an air raid, then everybody would not only turn their lights off, but also make sure that everything was totally dark by pulling down these dark shades in their windows, you know. So there definitely was a lot of home front activity. My parents, I have home movies of it. They're quite wonderful. During the war, they had their victory garden behind the house, you know, a tradition that then continued on into the 1950s and 60s, where they never stopped having their summer garden, but it started in 42 with a victory garden. So those are just a few personal reminiscences of the home front. I was a little too young to remember World War II, but I have, of course, talked to many people, including my parents, who lived through it.
And it is, you talk about the blackouts, of course, there were blackout drills across the coast, and it's really, it sometimes we don't feel as connected with everything that was happening at that time until sometimes you see physical artifacts like the rules for air raid in Portland. I was also struck by it was a German submarine map. So it was a submariner's map, a Nazi German map with, it was of coastal Maine with an inset of York and an inset of Portsmouth and Kittery and Portland on there, and a swastika in the corner, and you go, oh, I lived there. The enemy, they knew exactly where.
They know about us.
And it's those sort of material artifacts that really bring the war home. And with the Civil Defense Force, there was another interesting thing that develops out of this in World War II. This idea of we need to be prepared for something possibly, of course, the Cold War really following on the heels. But it's the Civil Defense Force in Maine becomes sort of the impetus for today Maine Emergency Management Agency and a lot of multi-agency interagency cooperation, and headed up at the time by Spalding Bisbee, who had been the regiment's first commander in World War II. He actually would be transferred and promoted on to serve in India. He would come back. And under those auspices, we also have the first woman in the Maine National Guard who basically was doing the job of an officer, and because the Civil Defense Forces fell under the auspices of the Maine National Guard, was doing the job of an officer. And her supervisor from John Healy from Skowhegan, who was himself a great war veteran, said, well, why can't we make her a lieutenant? And they said, well, that's not done. And he said, show me where it's written down in Maine law. And they couldn't. And so she became the first woman, first commissioned woman to be the first commissioned officer in the state of Maine in 1954, which I thought was very cool. Again, Maine doing its own thing where federal law wouldn't exactly allow it.
Well, and bear in mind, I know you know this well, Jonathan. Also, we have right after the war, I think it's 47, maybe 48, Margaret Shea Smith, very much in the Maine tradition, crosses the party lines and works with Harry Truman to develop and pass legislation that officially recognizes women in the national forces, and they are officially part of the Army, the Navy, the Air Corps, and so on.
It would be in 1954 that Captain Norma Parsons, originally from Waterville, would become the first woman officer in the National Guard as a whole. Serving, she was in New York, so we're reluctant to talk about that. But very, not accredited to Maine, but she's still a Mainer. But great stories that come out of it.
Jen, any other questions that people might have?
I have another question here from Guy Stever, and he wants to know who manned the barracks on the backside of the island and how long they were there. And actually, I can take this one. There were barracks on the backside of the island during World War I, but not during World War II. In World War II, Coast Guard men were stationed at the lighthouse, and they lived with the keeper's family, and they patrolled the backside of the island at night. And there was a checkpoint on Whitehead where they would write down when they had passed through. And Earl may know more about this.
Oh no, your wonderful website. Tell us all. Right. So I would just also comment from the home front perspective, and I know Jonathan and I were very much aware of this and talked a great deal about it. In regard to World War I, there was this massive mobilization not only of armed forces, but also of the public. In other words, the strategy that Woodrow Wilson developed and that Franklin Roosevelt continued when World War II came along, in many ways World War I was kind of a blueprint for World War II, was the total involvement of the populace, the war gardens, the buying of war bonds, the joining and supporting the Red Cross, the Salvation Army, every imaginable tactic to involve the public actively and get their support for the war effort. And we deal with things very differently today, but it was quite a strategy for both those wars, really.
Very much so. A whole of state approach, and there was so much going on in Maine at the time. In addition to everything that the Adjutant General's office was doing, they were also overseeing the draft that was done through the Adjutant General's office as well. But they were also there was a geological study done in Maine to look at the various types of natural resources that might be in Maine if this war dragged on even longer, and if so, if it became cost prohibitive or impossible to get resources from other places. Well, maybe in Maine, the areas that had certainly been off limits to mining because it just cost too much money. Well, if we can't get it from anywhere else, it was the geological survey. There were airfield surveys, and of course, new airfields were going in all over the place, all the way up from southern Maine, all the way up to Aroostook County, and it was a very happening place, as one might say. And I found one. We have to remember we're adjacent to Canada, and so there was a wonderful cross-border exercise that took place, I believe, in 1943 that involved the Maine State Guard, the Maine State Troopers, the Canadian Army sort of auxiliaries, and then some of the Royal Mounted Police, and it's just this great, and the Coast Guard as well. this great example of that neighborly relationship between Maine and New Brunswick that really continues on today.
And also, Jonathan, we were a training ground for a lot of British airmen as well. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Jonathan, very much for sharing this with us. Thank you, Earl, for participating. And thank you to Mandy for being our tech backup in case the internet on Monhegan failed us. And thank you all for attending. Have a wonderful evening. And this is a link to the website that we've created. And there we go. And please do go and take a look and learn a little bit more about Maine's role in World War II. Have a nice evening.
Thank you.